should I invite Professor Gurpreet Mahajan? Professor Gurpreet Mahajan has served as a very renowned professor at Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And since I was a colleague, I would always know that she would always insist, look here, your presentation in seminars, your presentation while you are defending your research proposal has to be invariably very clear and intelligible. It shouldn't be very unnecessarily complicated. And so she would, in a way, as a very good and concerned teacher, reprimand those who would reprimand is my word, not hers. So, so she actually was very concerned about this. I mean, she wrote very, her style of writing books and papers and presentation absolutely so lucid and so straightforward, and the flow was so easy. So I would really invite now Professor Gurpreet Mahajan to make her presentation, and she is a very good timekeeper herself. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Gopal Guru, for the invitation and for your very kind and generous words. I must say this is a rather interesting and challenging subject for discussion, though the EPW seems to me to be the most appropriate discussion forum for it, because to my mind, the articles in EPW tend to have a nice balance between getting something which is new in terms of data, engaging with conceptual innovations and tools, and making an argument. And at the end of the day, I think that's what one wants. And that's the crux of the thing. On the subject that we are discussing, and which Professor Guru has already laid out, poses many challenges. And I think at one level, one can empathize with this, with the idea that perhaps there is too much jargon at times that is used by the social sciences. And on the sort of frivolous side of it, a colleague and a dear friend, Sarah Joseph, who was also a contributor to EPW many times, we would in the 90s say, I think we should set up a service called Dial a Discourse. So you give us your material and we will dress it up in new kinds of vocabularies and languages and put it there. I'm just saying this only to say that this issue has been flagged now for a very long time. But often it is taken to imply as if what we are saying is that the level of difficulty is too high, or that there is, as Professor Guru said, too much conceptual mediation. And I think if we only focus on these two elements, we actually lose out on the strength of the social sciences and perhaps misunderstand where the problem really lies. And in whatever the time I have, I would try to actually suggest that there are 2-3 different elements that we need to keep in mind. And I see the problem not in terms of levels of difficulty or mediation of concepts, because every discipline has its own conceptual vocabularies through which it represents. After, we're also talking about social sciences, which are emerging as a process of very specialized study over a period of time in institutions of higher learning. So they're bound to create certain kinds of conceptual vocabularies. What is the challenge? And I want to say there are at least 2-3 different kinds of issues. First, keep in mind that there are philosophical traditions, and I have particularly the continental traditions in mind, the German and the French, which do think in terms of saying that we are addressing specialized audiences. So you can take the knowledge that you have obtained and communicate it differently and more simply when you are talking to a different audience. But the social science or philosophical discourses will have a certain degree of conceptual nuance, differentiation, and they expect the reader to have familiarity with the history of the concept, its usage, its distinction from other similar ideas. And that's very, very important. Though when you first read some of these philosophical texts, you have a feeling as though you are knocking on the doors of an elite club, which is very exclusive. You have to train yourself before you can really appreciate and understand what they are saying. But the effort has to be, the effort of training and reading them must yield something interesting, important, new and different at the end of the day. But if it is case of merely saying that, look, I have struggled hard and I've reached this point where I've been able to understand them, and therefore I must simply use the same vocabulary, to represent my ideas, and it becomes an end in itself, then that can yield some kind of difficulty, though that temptation is there, because if you spend so many years trying to understand a new language of philosophical discourse, then you think you have earned the right also to use it. So, but the idea is, what is it that you're using it for, and what is it trying to communicate? When it helps to create new layers of meaning which were otherwise lost, of course it is helpful. But if you use the language as like my wearing a flag saying I am part of this elite group which can understand and speak that language, then I think the difficulty arises. I think there is a second context in which we need to place this issue. And that context is in terms of the way we have come to understand the nature of social science, academic life, and research. Because if you look at, even at the early stages, you're doing MPhil or PhD, the expectation is that students are going to arrive at some original idea, not just a new way of representing the same thing, but an original idea. And I know when Professor Guru we were colleagues, he would very often ask me, and I remember this question, he said, what do you think is the average age of a philosopher? And this came in the context when we were thinking in terms of, or we in the sense in society, we were thinking in terms of people who have made outstanding contributions by the time they're 30 or 40, etc., etc. So he was really referring to Socrates, that ideas is getting a single idea and developing it, nuancing it, understanding its implications, and how it is built into relationship with others are elements that take a long, long time. One can't expect 20 new ideas in 2,000 different universities to be emerging every day. So, new ideas are few and far between. And when that is the challenge, the attempt is to focus much more on newness of vocabulary or language. And that's where the new element comes. And I think that's another context in which some of these difficulties of overburdening your work with jargon really emerges, when the focus shifts and say, well, that's what we are thinking in terms of arriving at and getting new vocabularies through which you can represent what may be otherwise familiar or everyday, and so on and so forth. And I think one should realize that's the kind of context in which some of this element is emerging. There's a third element that I want to bring in here, which is that for a long time we have this idea actually in the post-Wittgensteinian world, where you think that language represents in some sense the world. So you can't know the world independent of language. But on the other hand, there would be philosophers who would actually say that it is through language that we think, we articulate our ideas, and we also represent what is there in the world. So the focus invariably is much more on the words you use, the language you use, and then you think that when you are using a certain kind of language, you're already representing the world in it. And you are not really thinking in terms of, going beyond. The point I want to make is that in this framework, the focus is on representation of reality. And one can't get into details of why the shift has come in our scientific knowledge systems to representation. But I think when we focus merely on representation, we tend to lose sight of the fact that we are building arguments. We are trying to analyze certain existing viewpoints, ideas, thoughts, and trying to provide arguments in defense, in support, or in requiring modification of the same. But I think when you begin to understand the relationship between language and world in a certain kind of limited way, the focus shifts from argument to representation, and representation in and by itself comes to stand in for argument. And I think that's the most serious problem, where the idea of overburdening yourself with jargon really comes into play in the fullest. And we do have, and I don't think any one tradition should be is more guilty than the other in this regard, but it is true that in more recent times, some forms, some, not all, some forms of new literary theory and cultural studies have focused much more on the representation side of what the social scientists do. So you are using language as mode of representation, and therefore of, you know, describing what is there and leaving that in and by itself. And I think that loses out on something very, very significant, which I'm calling, for want of anything better, an argument, which is, you know, saying, well, this is the problem. This is how I think we can reflect on it, or this is perhaps the danger of looking at it in this sort of way, and the mistake we might make if we look at things in this sort of way. So extending and going beyond representation to some of these elements, I think is very, very essential for the social sciences. And in some sense, I think if one was writing, the thing to keep in mind really is, you know, philosophies of social science which have which prevailed at a certain time but have become somewhat passé to the side. And I'm thinking even people like Thomas Kuhn, who would remind you continuously that the quest for science and knowledge is about, he called it problem solving, even if you don't want to use the word problem solving. It is a way of addressing lingering questions and issues that you confront in the world in which you are living and inhabiting. I think if you keep that in mind, then you are in a position to be aware of existing conceptual vocabularies, which are necessary, because otherwise you'll be limiting yourself only to describing a given moment or a given event or phenomenon. If you want to be able to talk about a specific particular as well as others, and establish relationship between different kinds of occurrences, some conceptual vocabulary is needed. But you will need also to think in terms of the precise meaning that you want to have of this, because in representational mode, what happens is you are thinking in terms of play of words, how to invert existing vocabularies, how to open themselves to new meaning. Because by opening the same new possibilities of looking at the world differently. And I think there's some problem with taking that idea too far, which is what has happened, where you think in terms of you only to look at titles of seminars and or papers that we ourselves present, and I'm guilty of it sometimes, though I have limited capacity to be able to do that. You will find that there is so much emphasis on what the same words could denote, or should I say what they can connote in terms of possibilities that the same word and language throws up. And I think when we play with that beyond a certain point and make that, as it were, the most critical element in what you are saying, then there is an overburdening of jargon. If we keep in mind that that concept is being used with a view to communicate something else, I think there is no difficulty. You can. You're trying to communicate or address a certain issue and try to reveal different dimensions of it. I think there is no difficulty in taking that idea, however complex it might be, and giving it or leaving it with people from different situations, contexts, who don't necessarily share the same philosophical tradition or orientation. So the idea of your research is obviously to communicate. It must have that dimension. I think if we keep this single element in mind in terms of saying that the purpose is to be able to not only make sense of that reality, to try and find relationship of what exists with other elements and make an argument, I think then we are able to, overcome this difficulty. And I'll just end by saying that, look, often one confronts this issue because these days when seminars occur, even in more academic gatherings, students will get, or anybody, any speaker gets 10 to 15 minutes. And a common anxiety amongst especially PhD scholars, fresh PhD scholars, is how am I going to present something I've worked over for 3 years or 5 years in 10 minutes? Is 10 minutes enough? And I sometimes want to tell them that it is enough, because if the focus is on argument, what is it that you're pinpointing, which you want which you want to analyze, or for which you're offering a different analytic, it can be done in that little amount of time. Beyond that, if you think actually what you need to say has to be explained only in terms of different kinds of new vocabularies that you want to introduce, then I think you face a problem. And that's when I think social sciences get overburdened with jargon. Hopefully I've kept within the time limit, sir. I'll stop here.
No problem. We wanted you to hear you, but you've taken 14 minutes, so I'll stick to that.
14, oh, sorry.
No problem. Let me quickly summarize. I think Professor Mahajan has pointed out the sources of the problem of jargonism or jargonization in humanities and social sciences. I think just to summarize what she was pointing out is I mean, you are using jargon as a substitute, a supplement for serious thinking. You are actually being impatient and not allowing concept to take its own course historically. There's certain genealogy involved in the evolution of ideas. So, but you are actually forcing certain language, access language on you, on the concept that actually require more time for their own flourishing. This is the first source of problem Gurpreet has pointed out. The second problem, so you are impatient. So impatience leads to jargonism. Second point she raised was that I think when you actually possess, then concept becomes possession. Then there is a difficulty in actually freeing concept or language, conceptual language from jargonism. And the real problem, as she very rightly pointed out, is the problem of representation. Actually, you want to represent at the cost of argument. Argument will always require a very precise, concise presentation, and not presentation of concepts. But that particular precise presentation actually takes a backseat when representation takes over argument. And I would add, when your representation without thought, I think then it requires the supplement of jargon. And she has also pointed out how to go beyond all these problems and how to use efficiently and creatively the idea of new language. So thank you, Gurpreet. Now I would invite Professor Sundar Sarukkai, who is now at the moment visiting faculty to Society and Policy in Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. But I think he has just given a small bio, but he actually is thinking about new and very simple philosophical terminology for children. The Philosophy for Children is a new book which is actually written in English, but actually is translated in many 2-3 languages I know. And then he's the founder of the initiative called Barefoot Philosopher. I think these two things should explain as to why we have done a great job inviting him to this particular discussion. Sundar.
Thank you. Thank you, Gopal. It's a great pleasure to join all of you and to listen to Professor Gurpreet, who said much of what I wanted to say in a far more lucid manner. Thank you, Gurpreet, for setting the stage for what I want to say. There are many points which might overlap with what I'm trying to say, but I'll try and give certain particular examples to give sense of my own confrontation with this problem of jargon. I remember the first time I encountered this problem happened when I joined the institute, which I no longer am associated with. And there were a lot of retired scientists around, and there were a few social scientists and very, very few humanities like me in philosophy. And it always used to be the case that when anybody from the social sciences, we had the tradition of having everybody talk about their disciplinary work. You know, people, there could be a talk in physics a day, one day, and then something in sociology and so on. But what was very interesting is whenever anybody from the social sciences spoke, the scientist's typical response was that that is jargon filled. And part of my struggle with the question of either supporting jargon or responding to it came from this attempt. When I saw these things, I felt that they're not done the work, which I think Gurpreet also pointed out, the kind of work which you need to make sense of something which is being said. And these people are outside the system of discourse and yet wanted to mask their kind of lack of understanding by putting the blame on the kind of a language game which is happening in these discourses. Now, the real crucial point, which which led me to wonder about what they were saying was, at one level, what they were trying to say, and there's a larger problem of the fact of social sciences, which everybody seems to think they understand. Just because they read the newspaper, they think they know politics, they know political science and sociology, so they have a right to able to intervene. And what they were also trying to suggest whenever people use, when they use the term jargon, was that it could have been said in another way. So it's not just that we don't think we don't understand you, but we think the same thing could have been said in a simpler way. And that's a very different kind of approach to the question of jargon, because many times when they responded to these questions, it is that these certain concepts were unnecessary, etc. But on the same hand, but at the same time, what seemed to be very striking was that when people spoke from the context of, let's say, physics and mathematics, let's say quantum theory, people are using very heavy concepts. In fact, those disciplines are so jargon filled, but you will rarely note people calling them as jargon, because at some level, the use of these concepts in the sciences and mathematics seem to be unique and necessary to match the reality of the world. So the larger question, which the question of jargon we come back to, is the question of who is receiving what we are saying. And I want to extend what Gurpreet was saying by looking specifically at the question of audience, and then look at how the question of jargon actually differs from the kind of the audience who is looking at it. So for example, if I look at who is saying that we are using too much jargon, it could have been, as I said, some retired scientists, and then we also had people who would be who are so-called, who are not in the academic field, who would say it, because they felt they too had a stake in what we were describing and talking about, and they could do it in a better way. Now, if I look at it in terms of audience, and I'm going to give just one example because I think much has been covered here by Gurpreet. One is writing in research journals for an audience, and even there, many times when I read many of the academic journals, I often, sometimes it just surprises me because I read stuff which I don't understand, or even if I'm willing to put in the effort. And I also recognize that in research journals, the audience is something which is very different. The audience could be a global audience, which we are targeting when we write, even in Indian journals. And therefore, we invoke the kind of scholarship and kind of justification which we think a global audience or your global peers are looking for. And in so doing, of course, we lose out on our contact with the kind of people we are talking to. And that's a question which Gopal and me have talked about amongst ourselves a lot. And he raised this in the context of particularity and universality. We also know that all of us here, for example, we have written for newspapers and other medium in trying to talk about philosophy or social science in that manner. And we do feel that we can communicate something through that. But whether, if I compare that with what I write for, let's say, in a more so-called academic thing, I myself feel that sometimes that, when I used to write the newspaper column, I felt like I was actually saying something far more simpler. But then I also recognize after some time after reading it, that definitely that does not have the same content of what I'm saying when I write so-called in this academic style. But my real confrontation with this question of jargon also happened, as Gopal said, after we started this initiative with my students and colleagues on this Barefoot Philosophers. in trying to de-jargonize philosophy, for example. And our whole aim was to bring philosophy to the public and to children. And I remember when we first wanted to start the workshops on philosophy for children, almost everybody said, nobody will come who wants to do philosophy for children because philosophy is too heavy. And our point was not to make this point which Gopal said earlier. It's not to make, it was to simplify philosophy, but not make it
sorry, Sundar, can you adjust your mic,
the criterion for simplification, speaking to what Gurpreet was saying, was actually not about. Sorry, you lost me a bit.
Your mic,
can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Gopal?
Yes, now I can.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I think sometimes the thing fluctuates. Anyway, what I was saying is, so to illustrate what Gurpreet was saying, so when we did the workshops for philosophy for children, it was really not about presenting them concepts which they could then use, or presenting them names of whom they could say, who could stand for what philosophy was. What we did was to try and bring clarity of thinking about concepts. So, this question of arguments and how we make a particular stand very clear. The transparency and clarity came through as a part of our own attempt to bring philosophy to children. And, I must say that we were all very surprised when we had literally hundreds of people, both students and their parents, who wanted to do this philosophy for children workshop. And when we did the book, I remember even some education communities who published books said, no,
your voice is breaking. Sundar, your voice is breaking, maybe.
But I'm glad to say our whole exercise in trying to bring that both in English and other languages were driven by the fact that you can reach level of simplicity without being simplistic. Okay, let me cut off my video and talk if it's okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now, Gopal? I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you, but would you please switch off your?
Am I clear now? Can you hear me now, Gopal?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I've switched to this. So let me also give you another exercise we did in this question of engaging with the problem of jargon, particularly in the context of students. So when we started this program in Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, the first course we designed was called Reading and Writing. So to me, the point was not just to say that, look, these are serious things which we need to deal with, but actually to find out specific ways of trying to teach students ways of understanding the concepts of reading and writing before we taught them what the subjects were. And I must say that, at least from my experience, and we have had many students and colleagues who may agree or who may not agree with me. From my experience, the semester-long course on reading and writing, which drew on conceptual ideas of what reading and writing are, from philosophy, from literature, from the social sciences, actually enabled students to understand why something is written in a particular way. So I keep going back to the same point again, putting what Gurpreet is saying in a slightly different way. To me, the point about teaching reading and writing was to make them understand not what the author said, but why anybody, even if I want to say it, why would I have come to that point of view? And to do that, and as a whole semester program where we didn't teach English like we teach grammar or from largely driven to English literature or literary studies, but actually engaging very deeply with this question of what is the cognitive and the philosophical foundations of reading and writing. I must say I used one principle.
Gone, I think. Can anybody hear him? No. Sundar, I think it's gone.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me, Gopal?
Yeah, we just missed you.
I'm very sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'll just very quickly try and conclude. Sorry for taking this time. I don't know why this happens, but anyway, the point about falsification, and to me, one of the biggest difficulties students have with simple writing was be shown to be wrong. You are far more naked. You are saying something, and it's far easier for somebody who reads it and say, no, you are wrong. I don't agree with that. When many times when I find that people use jargon, is actually to avoid taking a stance in a particular sense. And I do agree. I think there's a lot of complex ideas where there's a great struggle, and philosophers know this well, struggling with language to capture what has to be said. But I still think that kind of effort which we can make out when we read are actually very few and far between. In most of the cases, there's a lot of qualification and hiding behind, rather than stating something out in a far more transparent manner. So to me, that was a very important attempt to keep showing them why this question of falsification, the ideas around it, are very important in the skills of writing. And the other point, which always I still don't understand much about why this happens, especially in the social sciences, when so much is invested in the question of language. Why is it that at foundational courses, I mean, are leaving some of their top departments, that foundational courses don't teach logic? If we feel that arguments and logic are very central to certain processes of thinking, even in the social science, there are many kinds of logics and complexities which you can do, and also a philosophy of language. I mean, I've dealt with so many students in anthropology and sociology for whom, they go on field work, they're collecting data from language, and yet to make them understand the point that to know what language is, to study the basic fundamental philosophical foundations of language from analytical thought, from continental thought, from philosophical traditions from Asia and Africa, and so on, doesn't happen. And to me, actually, that is one, I find it always, even including, by the way, with my camps with philosophy for children, it is really a particular methodology which liberates us from this anxiety of jargons, because it makes you understand what you are doing when you function with language at a very intimate level. And my concern was largely about how do we train students so that they don't end up duplicating this, they don't get caught up in this pressure. And this very good point Gopal said, impatience of presenting the concept rather than letting it grow. And that impatience, how do you stop that? And part of the point for me was actually training in, I know that now there are many writing courses everywhere, etc. But when we started it, for us, it was very different from some of the writing courses which universities do now. It was actually an attempt to try and see, can we engage with the question of jargon in a far more nuanced manner, rather than just talking in terms of something we understand or we don't understand. I'll stop here, Gopal, and I'm very sorry for the fluctuation in whatever happened.
Thank you, Sundar. I'm sorry for the failure of the technology that interrupted your very, very important speech. But I think what we understood from his presentation was how to actually practice doing simple thinking and simplifying concept through understanding, reading, writing, through workshops. That's a pedagogical initiative that he was talking about, and we can actually join issues with him when we discuss the issues in the last. Okay, thanks, Sundar. Now, may I invite Dr. Shashank Sinha, who's a dear friend and who's an independent researcher and writer. Shashank taught in the Delhi colleges for many years. Then he joined OUP. We did a book with him. And now he's the South Asia Publishing Director, which is a very, very important position. And we can understand now how difficult he must be finding to confront a text or a volume or a manuscript which is full of jargon. And but his research work has been very, very interesting. I mean, intersectionality between history and cultural anthropology. His work that he's publishing recently to Frontlines and is about the monuments and their meanings, and how to make how to write histories of cities, monuments, forts, is an interesting, very, very interesting foray of understanding, and we would be looking for his presentation. Shashank, please go ahead. You can take 14 minutes as everyone has taken.
Thank you, Professor Guru.
Yeah.
And thank you for this invitation, and delighted, of course, to be in this company. I think most of the as far as my positions on the thing is concerned, has been very beautifully articulated by Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, where she talks about conceptual vocabularies for different constituencies, and also the idea of communicating it well. And Professor Sundar Sarukkai, where he talks about the writing and researching things. I think 2 or 3 things. When we say too much jargon, I think the emphasis is on degree and intensity, right? So the basic terms of the debate have already been set out with simple, which is that academic research has different rules, different norms. It requires a different training, and it requires a different rigor, which also sometimes requires a use of certain jargon or conceptual frameworks. And the counterpoint, which is that it's difficult to read and understand. And the other part, which I would like to emphasize, in addition to both the speakers, is that it doesn't have a public connect. So difficult to read and understand, and has a different public connect. My own research on history, basically an aspect of history that I've been researching. I was earlier working on gender and tribe, and then on witch hunting, and now in the last 4-5 years, I've been working on monuments. And I realized that there is too much of a gap between academic and public understandings around these heritage sites, and how this has very damaging ramifications for the understanding of the discipline itself, basically. Now, whenever I talk about that, I think they have, both Professor Mahajan and Professor Sarukkai have talked about very specific instances. When I talk about, this kind of a topic, there are several layers which become important to me, and I'll do a bit of abstraction and digression from them, basically. And I go back to some of those when we talk about a spectrum between jargon-rich and accessible writing, there are several layers there, basically. So one is, of course, and some basic questions become very important when we do that. What is the function of academic research? And what is the function of knowledge produced in an academia? By filtration, does it mean that a relatively more informed society? Now, is the audience in dense academic research or a jargon is become a very personalized audience? We talk about a very impersonal research, but are we talking mostly in terms of making it comprehensible to peers, or in an added level filters then to the research students and then the larger academic communities? As far as public connect is concerned, is it required or desirable? Right? If yes, does the responsibility lie with the author or the writer? If no, are there adequate knowledge networks or platforms, right, which could translate the research and make it accessible to the larger audience? Connected to it is another point, which is basically, do we have that developed level of teaching and pedagogic skills, which can make this, jargon-rich, writing, research or, comprehensible to students or the larger academic community? And then is also, there are questions which are related to pragmatics of research, or the politics and dynamics of production and consumption of knowledge. Right? And here we have 2 or 3 things, basically. One is that, in terms of the rigor that is required for research and publications, or for funds and fellowships, or for career advancement, or for acceptance in the larger academic community. I had this very interesting, and yesterday, I just, by way of information, I just put it on my Facebook. And while the idea was purely information and I wasn't expecting anything, I realized that there are people who are writing about it. Right? And they were saying that, if you don't use a jargonized language, you'll not be taken. They were very, I'll just sum up, and I being fully aware that this is too small a sample to, arrive at any larger argument. But these were very interesting, basically. So while some of them said that, you won't be taken seriously if you don't use jargons, basically. And that it would be dismissed, if it is too readable, the rigor of the research is dismissed. Then people talked about tyrannies of jargons, and that how they, is there a coterie, basically, or how you require it for certain fundings as well. Now, when we talk about the politics and dynamics about the production and consumption of knowledge, there are 2-3 things become important, one of which I already talked about the responses that we have, and then whether the idea is to express or impress the peers, or on the larger things about, this thing, and also about, whether these are connected to the, ideas of, promoting a kind of a culture of exclusivity. Now, when we talk about, jargons, there is a differential applicability in terms of natural and humanities, and so natural sciences and humanity and social sciences. And as Professor Sarukkai was talking about, there is a greater acceptability in jargons in natural sciences. A point that, Jahir Babar also made in an article in published long back in EPW, where the meanings are very clear, where the meanings are very specific. But that simply doesn't mean that, theory, concepts, and models are not there within, the humanities and social sciences. And they all require, as Professor Mahajan was talking about, basically their whole conceptual vocabularies. They require a newness of vocabulary. She was putting it very beautifully in terms of and certain argumentation, and that requires, a use of a certain, jargon. But then the other point she made was also very, very important, is about communicating that. That can be communicated in a very clear and precise manner. And then coming back to the layers, is accessible writing, a kind of a different skill set. The point that Professor Sarukkai was talking about, training in writing about, accessible writing, and whether that could lead to distractions of research. Are there different set of skill sets, basically, that you write for a more accessible writing? And then 2 other things I feel are important. One is this, the role of social media and the internet revolution, and also the role of socio-political context. And I'll talk about here about, my own research, share experiences from my own research on heritage and history, which I've been talking about. I've been researching on monuments, for the last few years, and I did come up with this book, which was very conscious attempt to, focus on 3 cities which are very well researched, and 6 UNESCO World Heritage sites which have been most well visited and most well researched as well. And I could see big gaps between that. Now let me come to the point that I was, why I thought that here in some cases the constituencies could be different, and sometimes the positioning could be different as well. And here the academic public connect is very consequential. Now, heritage sites stand at the intersections of several allied disciplines. It's history, archaeology, architecture, preservation and conservation studies, travel and tourism, heritage studies, all of them feed into each other. And as Professor Guru was relating, monuments are just not about builders, they have a whole range of meanings, basically. So there are, and I try and spell out the different layers there, in terms of their larger geocultural connections, in terms of the historical context. They also talk about the afterlives of monuments, which, impart a different meaning to the monuments, and also the balance between the tangible and intangible. And yet, one of the things we discovered, during the research was that, how they are very critical sites for public consumption of academic, of historical knowledge, basically, in the sense that no other sources have. And this is because monuments and museums, unlike many other sources, are sites where you are face to face with objects, tangible objects, right? And this is one of the things I was reading a very recent piece, recent report by American Historical Association, which they also, say that, how monuments are, or heritage sites are very critical sites for public consumption of historical knowledge. So a deep understanding of the monuments works in favor of all the different parties involved, whether it is conservation studies or historians and things like that. Now, 2 other things which I thought were very, very important, is that these monuments have also become very political sites as well. So there are multiple narratives floating around the monuments, which are competing and rivaling with each other, thanks also to the social media and internet revolution. Now, interesting part which differentiates them from academic research, basically, is that, while multiple narratives add to a body of research or add to a texture of research, now some of these narratives, basically tend to displace or upturn the existing ones, and they have their own constituencies, but which is something that one should be very mindful of while researching on things which have a greater public connect. Now, when I started researching and looking for books and looking for research, I realized that academic research on monuments, does not inform the understanding of the sites and connected histories. When I say connected histories, I say it's not just about builders, it's about the whole idea about geocultural connections, historical context, afterlives, and the tangible and the intangible. So either they do not reach directly, or they are not adequately, there are no adequate communicating platforms which translates or transmits the research in a more comprehensible manner. And neither do they get reflected in the teaching and pedagogy skills, that where these courses are taught. So most people, including students of history, rely on sources, basically where their things are challenging. And as far as the public consumption is concerned, I realized that, they are more or less focusing on 3 or 4 different sources. One is the travel websites, which replicate the same information with some rephrasing here and there. The second is the guidebooks, basically, which, make this thing very comprehensible. And none of this guide, I found to my utter dismay, that many of these guidebooks were not updated since the early decades of 20th century. So what they have done, they have used a lot of this thing, photographs, recent photographs, but using a text. Now, what has happened in academic research is that the last couple of decades, a lot of research has happened which completely modifies our understanding of a monument. But then these do not get reflected in the meanings that we have for that, I can give several examples, but one example I can give it, if some of you have visited Qutub Minar, the most primary site, in the Qutub Minar complex is the mosque, right? And this mosque, there's a whole story about this mosque, it is now known as Quwwatul Islam Mosque, which means might of Islam. Whereas in all the historical sources refer to it as Qubba Islam, which is a sanctuary of Islam. And how this, ability to, communicate very effectively has completely changed the meaning of this mosque. And this fits in where a very, our very commonsensical understanding of the history of that period, where we see that the Turks have come here, conquered. And so the might of Islam logic fits in very well. But the idea was to say that it was a sanctuary of Islam, particularly when there were attacks in Central Asia, and there were a lot of people who were migrating to Delhi around that time. So how it changes, basically the meanings and the context, therefore, right? So in some cases, these things are very important. So, and it is not just the accessible language, but also commensurate packaging and communicating. So, and when I talk about monuments, there are, we have to use terms in architecture which are very technical, which are jargon, but I think, explaining them, and organizing the material is actually important. And in that context, when I talk about, appropriate communication platforms, there was a very interesting, thing called the conservation.com. Right, the conservation.com is a news site in the US, basically, which talks about, it makes, very complex academic research, in a very, palatable language, available to this. And there is a lot of academic rigor and research rigor that goes into making those things. So the idea is given, the credit is given to the author, but a lot of editors work for it. And then this whole idea, which I thought, basically that whole idea of concept of public scholars, whether it's public historians or public intellectuals, is also something which has really not taken off in a big way, basically. Now, I'll just, add, 2 minutes of it, basically, and then conclude is that, the interesting bit is that how in the modern times, how in the more recent times, the systems that produce and consume academic knowledge are changing, and are changing fast. So there is whole idea about, accessibility, discoverability, making this idea. And, most of us are familiar that, this whole movement or the thrust towards the open access, where they're talking about making it accessible, knowledge. But the one of the contradictions there is they're not talking about making accessible, in terms of language, but in terms of whatever is available, by way of that research, whether that is understandable or comprehensible is something which needs to be done. And then there is a lot of emphasis on, on adding to the discoverability, where you're talking about metadata, the keywords, abstracts. So this whole idea about, the whole systems that produce and consume knowledge are changing. Also, significantly, there talks about the use of multimedia, which is going to, in the recent years, affect the way in which content is received. Also, about academic social networking sites like academia and ResearchGate, or the way social media or blogs are present, and then this idea about impact factor or the citation index, all those things, but I'll end with this thing then also, that how questions are being raised about the applicability of research and how questions are being raised about the spending on social science and humanities research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank. I think it was clear, categorical. As the good historians, you actually stuck to your protocols. And secondly, you raised 2 points, Shashank. One point is the ethics of using the language. What impact does it really have on public imagination, producing knowledge, if you really use jargon? So there is the ethics of actually using language in our thinking and imagination, and communicating it to larger public. Second point you're raising, which is an important point, is that peeling out different layers of meanings, actually avoid any use of jargon. So, but people, so you are in a way suggesting that because the moment you actually avoid analysis of monuments or other things, you are actually inviting yourself. You will be lost to this use of jargon because you are avoiding analysis. Analysis is a sure way of avoiding jargon. So these 2 important points you're raising, and thank you so much for your presentation, Shashank. So we'll have discussion. I think there are a lot of questions that have come up, but we can take them in the last. Now I will invite our friends from curating knowledge. Who is going to go first, Sayan or Vrinda?
So we'll alternate. So maybe you can.
Okay. But this. Let me. Okay, so these 2, Sayan and Vrinda, are actually doing. They are running the forum of curating knowledge, and they are concerned about actually creating, generating or producing or enabling students and teachers and other sections of society which are actually related to education to create critical reflection on educational experience and practices. They also are actually running certain forums to actually mediate and create and mediate content for creating this critical reflectivity, not reflectivity, critical reflection on educational experience. I think this is a very, very important forum that the work they are doing. And somebody's phone is intersecting, I think. Is it all right now? So so it is actually their effort is to actually fill conversation with critical reflection, which actually is missing now because we don't have any critical reflection. We are conversing and communicating. This is a very important exercise that Aaina as a forum is doing, and we are actually now looking forward to your very, very critical intervention. So who is Vrinda is coming first?
So I'll start and then Vrinda.
Okay. First Sayan and then Vrinda. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Guru, for that introduction. And I think many of the conceptual premises for the work we are doing have been already mentioned by previous speakers. So what we'll do is we are going to actually show examples of how we are in fact trying to tackle questions of reimagining academic and research communication. Now, before we show what we are doing, I think just to sort of give a broad label, I think what we are broadly doing can be thought of as public pedagogy, which is, I mean, in a very sort of simple way of putting it would be the development and production of critical knowledge outside strictly formalized academic systems for an expanded public. Now, of course, this can take on a variety of forms, ranging from newsletters, newspaper articles, as Professor Sarukkai was mentioning, pamphlets, media interventions, and different forms of non-institutionalized research. And there are challenges and there are limits and possibilities to all of these. But what seems to be a common impulse, right, to do this kind of work is that it identifies a problem with normative academic production. And I think some of these points have already been established, so we are not going to about them too much. But things like, the conventional use of a rather difficult, jargonized, and distant language, right, or the lack of perceived reach and impact, or the alienating institutional rituals within which academic work might happen. Now, Vrinda and I started Aaina a year back. Subsequently, we have 4 more members, including Joita, Nidhi, Shruti, and Pista, our illustrator. But our impulse was that a lot of the research that's being produced in education departments in particular, or to some extent in sociology departments too, wasn't necessarily reaching communities it would deeply benefit. And we are here primarily thinking of participants in educational spaces, whether these are teachers and students across disciplines, across schooling and university contexts, or even practitioners on the ground, whether these are they're working in NGOs or in activist spaces. And we felt this research has a powerful potential in helping understand sort of structural oppression, but it wasn't somehow able to sort of reach, or because of a variety of reasons. So we found that, of course, in the anecdotes and conversations that we witnessed and heard around us, that teachers are struggling with, let's say, difficult staff rooms, which ends up impacting their sort of teaching, their well-being. Students are struggling with hierarchical power dynamics within the classroom and in different sort of university spaces. And of course, there are larger structural problems of access and funding, which impact everyday educational experience. So we wanted to sort of create an initiative through which we could document many of these problems. And, just to take from what, Gurpreet Mahajan was saying, that we wanted to both represent and frame an argument. And we sort of wanted to convey critical research-based understandings, of these problems in more accessible formats. And, we started on social media handles on Instagram, Facebook, and our plan is to, of course, expand into more sort of formats. And we initially we was playing around with different visual formats, but ultimately we hit upon the form of the comic, right? And so we produce our content through comics in particular. And we wanted to sort of do it in a conversational register, right? And we wanted to map conversations that are already being had, in different sort of educational spaces. And we wanted to connect theoretical sort of ideas or issues with everyday experience. Our central sort of ethical and political agenda, however, was to particularly address inequality in educational spaces, right? These are inequalities of access, inequalities in terms of lived experience, inequalities in terms of what kinds of curriculum is represented and so on, and also give certain starting points for how to think of alternatives. Now, I'm going to share my screen and just give you a sense of what this project is. So this is our Instagram page. Can everybody see it? Yeah. So as you can see, these are sort of different posts, and each of these posts go into different sort of topics or themes in education, right? Now we source these posts through our own experience, through reading and conversations within our team, but also conversations with different sort of practitioners. And we end up then following a few templates. Like, for example, one template would be a conversation between individuals. In fact, this is based on a paper published in EPW recently, which, it's a conversation between sort of, as we call them, tech bros, right? Who are talking about, how edtech is amazing and, it's so the best thing that has happened in education. And also through the conversation, sort of a critique kind of emerges of what the problems are, right? Then there's another template we use where we sort of show scenes in education, right? So we show, so for example, this is a more student centric post where we show how, let's say, in debating club culture, there are various kinds of exclusions that happen, right? So whether it's sort of when these events are organized because of which there is a lack of participation by women, then in terms of what kinds of issues or topics are used in this debating, clubs, which, many people feel alienated from culturally, and sort of then we sort of show, we give a framing of, how to understand this issue. Now, I want to take up one post and talk about it in a little more detail. Now, what we're doing is somewhat analogous to, I suppose, an academic inquiry, in that we first identify a problem, which is based on our existing reading and conversations. And then what we do is we try to identify a situation where this problem is being manifested. So while this problem is structural, we want to sort of identify, okay, what are quote unquote more common or relatable or easily accessible sort of experiences where it happens. Now here we are trying to talk about the lack of and a discourse of emotion, in pedagogic discourse, right? So for example, we know that teachers are experiencing a multiplicity of complex emotions. They may be alienated or they may be drawn towards certain things, but there is not enough vocabulary, right, to be able to think through emotions, right? Now this idea, I guess, has been more sort of captured in research on teacher emotions in the West. But we also found that many of these experiences resonate with teachers we were talking to. And then what we try to do is in our dialogue, we try to sort of identify certain issues or thoughts or ideas, right, that again has a sort of analytic underpinning. So for example, when this teacher is thinking, this teacher is asking a question to students and students are not answering, and the teacher is thinking, oh, just answer, I need to move on to the next chapter. But this is of course premised on the idea of how, we have an inflexible sort of curricular system, right, where the emphasis on sort of finishing or completing the syllabus is not allowing you, let's say, the time or the patience or the space to sort of, go through each topic individually. But also at the same time, this teacher is negotiating with her own sense of authority, right? And this is something that we find again in a lot of the sociological literature on teaching as well as teacher emotion discourse. That notions of authority are mediated by social constructions of who the teacher needs to be and what they're aspiring to be. Now, once we sort of try to bring it down to the bare bones of what that thought is, then we frame it. Then we provide an argument. Now, of course, there's a limitation because we're providing the argument in just sort of one slide, and it's tricky, it's complicated. There are challenges. We are sometimes dissatisfied. We'll talk about this towards the end of our presentation. And what we try to do is, initially we try to show, okay, these are the reasons why this problem happens, right? So based on what we are reading and what we've talked to people about, we say, okay, these are some of the important or prioritized sort of issues why teachers grapple with a range of difficult emotions, right? And then we provide an alternative in terms of, okay, what could happen instead, and why does, and how teacher emotion discourse needs to be a part of teacher training discourse, right? So this is broadly what we do. So I provided a schematic overview of what we are doing. Now, Vrinda is going to talk about how we grapple with language and how we deliberate upon language as we sort of frame our posts. So Vrinda, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sayan, and thanks, Professor Guru, for introducing us. The premise again has been talked about by speakers before me, so I'll try to keep that short and sort of go more in detail about our linguistic process. So a lot of what academic or research communities might not do adequately, so in the writing in courses on research methods, is deliberating on language use, so micro language use to broader sentence structures and everything. So what happens then is that jargon might be used in a manner or at places where its function might not be clear to either the author or the reader. So there are some questions then we need to ask. When a specific disciplinary term is being used, has it been mutually decided upon by members of that academic community? Then is the function more semantic, so is it related to meaning, or is it being used for a certain aesthetic appeal, like it sounds good, or I think as Dr. Sinha said, it conveys an apparent rigor. And then a common attitude towards jargon is a defense of its necessity, but we also need to ask if the work of thinking about aesthetic and linguistic alternatives is being done at all. and through what tools and through what kinds of training is it being done. So when specific disciplinary terminology is employed to describe an issue, are there conversations between scholars on the reasons for their choice, or what other linguistic forms could or couldn't convey the same or a similar idea? And then how do we begin to think of lucidity? Like, what all does lucidity entail? Because it's necessary to break that down, because even sometimes when there's an intent to be to be accessible, everyone might not have the tools to think through different grammatical or syntactical choices. So with Aaina, how we work through the question of language is both at the level of process and at the level of the specific formats we use. As Sayan said, we identify a problem, speak to people, read up on it, and then we decide on a frame. Now this frame provides us two different linguistic options. So the first part of the post is usually a conversation or a dialogue slide, and then there's a last slide which is all text. So the dialogue slides would often show familiar characters in familiar settings. So this is teachers, student, parents, and they're participating in their everyday settings, but through their speech or thought, they're demonstrating instances of a particular problem or different perspectives and experiences around it, which can reveal certain layers on an issue. Then here we attempt to make language something that audiences would resonate with, something that they would have heard at home, in schools, in universities. Then, of course, we differ from most academic writing here, as we have the option of first fictionalizing conversation. We can make up the conversation between the different characters. And secondly, we can represent what people are thinking instead of what they're only speaking. The last slide, which is usually a couple of paragraphs, as Sayan also showed, is where we go slightly more abstract. That's where we contextualize the issue. That's where we explain the different points and also try to offer some alternatives. So here, going back and forth within the team and having a constant dialogue really helps. So our attempt remains to make it readable, short, and intuitive for readers. So sometimes we try to develop alternative words for discipline internal contexts, but try to do it without being reductive or without oversimplifying it. So I'll now show an example for a post. Yeah, is this visible? Yeah. Yeah, so this is a post on school admission inequalities. So here we show different instances through which admission processes in private schools might be reinforcing or creating certain inequalities. So the first slide is about the admission form. Now, admission form sometimes has questions that can create a bias, and often do create a bias about who schools are willing to admit, which is that if members of the family have previously studied, what's the socioeconomic position. Then the second slide is about capitation fee, how people can exploit the networks to get into certain schools. And the third is about parent interviews, and when parents are interviewed, even though it's not legal practice, when they are interviewed in schools, that obviously reveals a lot about their social position and who the schools are willing to take. Now, in the last slide, so the sociological concept that we wanted to discuss in this was social closures, and which is the mechanisms through which middle classes or certain groups would monopolize resources to avail certain opportunities while excluding other groups from doing the same. So we wanted to avoid using the term social closure here, and hence what we went with was how hierarchies are maintained through invisible processes. And I would also like to use this slide to show a couple of other simplifying or de-jargonizing efforts that we make. So first is, for instance, capitation fee might not be an intuitive word for a lot of our readers. So we would sort of qualify it with donations or capitation fee. Similarly, a lot of, I think, conversation, so something that we want to avoid doing is just saying caste and class privilege, but also underlining what are these markers. So here, that's why we went with accent, complexion, income, schooling, status of job, and residential address. So yeah, then the process of feedback and conversation from within team and sometimes from people outside who we are speaking to, that really helps, because while our aim is to use intuitive language, what vocabulary is intuitive, or what sequence of ideas is intuitive to introduce an idea, that is often subjective. So coming upon a mutual consensus on that proves to be quite useful. Then the final thing I'd say right now is that another aspect of language that we use is also related to how it's being read, and Sayan would talk more about it in his next section. But we here don't want to only depict reality or just report on issues. So while linking theoretical work with experiences, we also want to provide people a vocabulary or some frameworks through which they can think through their experiences across disciplinary and educational contexts. So we don't want to be using the vocabulary only of the discipline education or sociology. And we also want that beyond just being relatable, we can also model certain conversations. So we might show conversations that real people aren't having in like real university spaces, but we believe that there's a need for those conversations, and by presenting them through our posts, we might be able to provide a talking point for the same. Sayan will go next.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly add a couple more points and then Vrinda will conclude. So I think, there was a point mentioned before about, the personal connect, with the public, right? And how do we think through it? Now, one of the interesting aspects of doing this kind of production, on social media, right? And given, as was also mentioned before, that today sort of the forums of dissemination and conversation are, of course, expanding beyond traditional sort of research enclaves and forms. Another thing that we find interesting is to think of how the audience or the public then interacts with us, right? So to give a sense of some of the things that happen and certain possibilities that open up, right? Which are perhaps sometimes restricted in academic or sort of formalized academic conversations. So one is like people share their experiences very freely, right? So people write to us talking about, okay, how they relate to it, or they have gone through something similar. They want to give us more data for us to kind of explore and represent it. Sometimes it's just to show a kind of affection, right? So there's a kind of affective diversity that we find frequently, and this can sort of range from very sort of we love to reactionary sort of hate. Of course, then there are people who are giving us arguments which are challenging our positions, pointing out how some of these may be simplified positions, and of course, then pushing us to think beyond what we have said. Right? Sometimes there are people telling us about how they're introspecting on their sort of own complicity in different acts of discrimination, which is very interesting, right? So I think it's because perhaps it is no longer a detached kind of concept that you're trying to understand, but you're in fact seeing yourself reflected in a moment where somebody is being discriminated or humiliated. And once you sort of understand why it's happening, somehow it's sort of giving them the tools to then say, okay, I was also complicit. And of course, there are people across sort of communities, right? So one of the things that's happening is that the public that we're engaging with is expanding, right? So we started perhaps with a sort of narrower pool of university teachers and undergrad students or MA students, but now we have school teachers, right, across government and private school settings. We also have, of course, people who are outside academia, right, and who might be sort of doing sort of different kinds of jobs, but have an interest in understanding, okay, what are these educational debates? And what we then get exposed to are also different styles of thinking. So when sort of the audience is interacting with us, they're giving us sort of different inputs from different vantage points. And there's a cognitive and linguistic possibility there, right? So what we end up identifying are sort of a variety of sort of linguistic registers, right? Through which people are sort of understanding and interpreting their own experience. And perhaps this is something to think about, within the university itself, because what seems to be frequently missing is a mapping of the linguistic and cognitive diversity of the public in the university, right? And instead, of course, there's an aspiration towards a more standardized kind of rhetoric, but this kind of mapping would be perhaps quite useful and productive. And the final thing I want to say is about how, when we, are engaging with sort of these communities, we are also, challenging them. So there is a sort of danger in the politics of relatability, right? So there are students, let's say, who will join, our page because they think that we are, critical of teachers. And teacher bashing, as we know, is a very popular kind of narrative in social media, right? And while we'll have a post where we are critical of teachers, right, particularly elite teachers, but what will happen is that, the next post very deliberately would be where we are critical of students, right? And the following post would be sort of showing sort of the teacher, sort of the complexity of teaching and why is it that, a teacher is sometimes unable to do what they want to do because of structural factors, right? So what we're trying to do is to kind of bring in different audiences who may be in prior antagonistic kind of relations. And we are not saying, okay, resolve their differences. Differences are, some of the antagonism is essential and necessary, for sort of a pressure to be dismantled. But of course, we are saying that, look, this is a space where you can come and you're being invited to reflect on your own experience, on your own blind spots, and also try to understand what is it that constitutes the experience of a community that you have not, empathized with or engaged with. Right? So finally, I think—
Yes, please. You want to, is Vrinda speaking?
Sorry?
Sayan, will Vrinda wrap up, or what you are going to wrap up?
Yeah, so Vrinda's going to wrap up now.
Please give us some chance.
Yeah, Vrinda's going to wrap up now by pointing out some of the limitations that we are working through.
Yeah, so like I'll mention the limitations or some constraints that we have faced at Aaina, and I think they might apply to other academic communication projects also. So of course, all formats and platforms come with certain limitations, and like at Aaina, there are times we have struggled with communicating theoretical ideas. So especially when the research we are drawing upon is in Western contexts and there's no immediate experience here that we can map it onto. Similarly, there are also theoretical debates that we can't condense within the format we are using. For example, in a post we had that critiqued the idea of mother tongue education as it was proposed in NEP. We couldn't problematize the term mother tongue in our post. So even though the word is quite contested. So, and we usually choose narrow and specific frames for our posts. For example, instead of saying assessment is discriminatory, we would choose to demonstrate this to multiple posts, like on class presentations and examinations, how they specifically can be discriminatory modes of assessment. But in choosing a narrow frame, there are times when where the alternatives we suggest might be dissatisfying even to us, or there are more macro structural concepts that we cannot connect the post to. Then there are times when we have to omit certain nuances because we choose to prioritize certain other points. So there was this post we had about studying abroad, and there we used the phrase, this reflects a colonized attitude, but we couldn't elaborate on it more, even though that might not be a term that everyone has an immediate resonance with. One other small thing that our current formats don't allow for tracing, don't allow us to do is tracing historical trajectories of a theme or an issue. So some other formats might be better suited to that. Then a major problem is that we are working only with English, and that's so that limits our audience, but also the kinds of issues we can raise, since a lot of the conversations that we represent, they might not be happening in English actually. And then there are constraints that would be specific to the platform. So especially like when we're working with social media, so there's lesser of an opportunity to hold sustained conversation with those who are critical of or disagree with what we have put up. Then there's also the issue of Instagram demography. At the end of the day, we never really know, like we don't have an accurate idea of who we are talking to or what the social positioning is. So it is definitely limited and not representative of the participants in educational spaces. I just leave with some questions that might be useful for everyone. But so one is, how do we plan ahead? How do we include more issues, more perspectives that is beyond our immediate range of experiences? Then how do we democratize this work more? How do we include inputs from more people, build dialogues that can be carried by individuals and organizations across spaces? So how can what we create be used as a resource independently? Then how do we begin to do this this work in other languages, which is not a mere act of translation, which uses other languages, the forms of knowledge there and all? Then finally, how do public pedagogy initiatives remain self-critical, and how do they assess and reflect on how the work is being received? So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sayan and Vrinda, for your very, very insightful presentation. I should admit that your project Aaina is actually escaping the sides of jargonism, or somebody called jargoneering, engineering jargoneering. That's a good word. Which is very important. But your target is basically schools and not so much colleges, I guess. And you're talking about different language, which cannot be jargonized, I guess. Maybe, can you really jargonize the language of emotions? You can always jargonize the language of reason, but not emotions. That is what you are suggesting. And so you are bringing into your classroom transaction the language of emotions. And which I agree with you that we don't have much on this at any levels of our educational system. And as Vrinda has also pointed out, what are the difficulties, and your feedback is very important. I think through these different platforms, you are actually trying to connect with people with the language that you want to promote, you want to actually make accessible to people. One of the languages, fictionalism, which will be very interesting. Fictionalizing conversation. I think that is how you actually ensure the participation of the people. At the moment you utter some jargon, your utterances will actually scare them away. And as Shashank has said, the tyranny of jargon. And so I think it is really very, very important initiative. And I wish you all the very best, and we'll have some conversation on this, some debate on this. Do we have some time? We have little time for. There are many questions. And
Yes.
we have 24 questions. So would you please take some 3 to 4 solid questions? I'm sorry, I don't want to hierarchize them, but there may be some serious questions. So please, discretion is yours now. I have no control on what question has to be asked and not to be dropped.
Yes, sir. So this question is from Jatinder Singh, and he's asking what role institutions, primarily universities, can play in making students learn to avoid jargons. And he has not directed it to any particular speaker. So,
but all these answers are given by Gurpreet Mahajan and Sundar Sarukkai and Dr. Shashank, how to avoid jargons. And our friends from Aaina.
Yeah.
So it is there.
And there is another question which says, in what manner jargoneering in media communications is different from that in the academia?
We have, I mean, I think perhaps, I don't know whether Dr. Shashank Sinha can try this out.
I think it's a difficult one for me, because of my primary location not in the media sector.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, this, but somebody said it is recycling garbage. That's what somebody said in the question answer. Editing is some kind of
recycling garbage.
Garbage, yeah. But that only means it's the language. No language is garbage. Yeah, sorry. Whether it is in media or whether it is in academics, jargon may be cumbersome. It's not a garbage. Let us not disrespect the language. So, but we have a different shades of. I mean, I'm also not I'm not expert on this comparative accounting of language in media and academics. Academics can be descriptive, but I think media today has lost that depth and width of actually presenting descriptive analytical language. There was some kind of indexing, some newspapers, that indexing of themes has disappeared completely. So I think media has become so vacuous of the language which you speak to the people, speak the language of the people. After all, people also produce different vocabulary, which is complex vocabulary, simple but very complex for others who do not share that experience, that landscape. So I think media, there's definitely there's a difference between the two. Our media in India has a different language altogether. It connects to certain people, sensitization, dramatization, and all that, to say the least. Does anyone want to speak, Gurpreet or Sundar, on this?
No.
Not on this, but I can take some other questions that were there in the chat since I read them.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just make 2 or 3 sort of observations with regard to some of those questions. One is about, can we have jargon in the language of science? I think there's a lot of discussion on it, and which is because this was an experiment of the logical positivist. Can you have a precise language which represents things as they exist in the world? But obviously in the social sciences, we are not only trying to talk about things that exist, we are talking about relationship between things. And invariably, like Vrinda said, we want to talk about colonization, or the experiment is basically, extension of that experience or whatever. You are using terminologies and concepts which are imbued, which bring in another layer, intermediary layer of meaning. And that is inevitable in the social sciences, as in many other disciplines. I think not only in the social sciences, even in the sciences, this happens. So not everything can be in terms of merely physicalist language, if by science that is what is meant, which has only one single reference point. The second issue that I want to address is the one which has been flagged by using Gayatri Spivak, namely that she said in saying simple things, because I know Gayatri Spivak raised this question, asked me, she said, why do you find X, Shudipto Kaviraj, easier to understand and me difficult? So I think this is a question actually that Sundar had flagged. Difficulty by whom? Whom are you talking to? If you're talking to an audience which is uninitiated and does not know, even if it's an informed academic audience, does not know the same tradition of thought that you are using, but using a conceptual vocabulary which is very specific to that tradition, then there will be difficulties encountered. So it's not a case of saying that simple things would lose out. I think part of our issue really is this. And then when we are thinking in terms of less jargon, we are not saying less jargon, we're saying you need translatability. You need to find ways by which you'll translate what is being communicated in that tradition through this concept so that it can reach a larger audience. So that's the second thing I wanted to say. Third thing is in terms of an issue, lots of questions which are around this idea of representation and argument. There is a connect between the two, I don't deny. I think sometimes you have to accentuate the binary in order to make the point. I think the stronger binary would have been to say representation versus focus on explanation. Okay, so that when you are thinking about focus on explanation, you are thinking in terms of the way something has been represented in a given framework. How do you explain away the anomalies that exist? Why is it my reality or my experience doesn't really cohere with that? You are raising issues of this kind. But when you are thinking in terms of certain modes of not focusing on the challenges that come from that reality, but really focusing on how to represent through language certain what you have in mind, I think if that is an end in itself, that is limiting. Lastly, about power play, I think there are several things one should keep in mind. We've already, I hope, agreed that some amount of mediation is necessary and inevitable for us in whatever we say or do, and that is going to be there. Academic life is meant to provide you some preparation in understanding the history of that mediation, that particular use and vocabulary. In that sense, maybe all forms of education is intended to be, and whatever language you use within it is intended to be, one should just say destabilizing, because it makes you question the way you were thinking about your own role, position, the social structure, etc., etc. It may also end up in some sense affirming it, but jargon per se is not part of that. So we shouldn't think that use of language is only a case of power play. It can become so in certain situations, and that is the one to guard against. If language is a mode only of differentiating yourself from others and saying that you are able, as Professor Guru said, if you don't wait for the concept to do its full work in thought, but use it as a shorthand only to display that you have familiarity or an apparent familiarity with that concept, then of course there will be distinctions and differentiations that emerge. But in principle, there is nothing inherent if you are able to understand, if the concept is communicated to you properly, there's nothing to prevent anybody from understanding it, and it need not necessarily be an instrument of power play. So that's, I think, the range of questions I thought I would address.
Okay, thanks, Gurpreet. Sundar, you want to say something on the language in either jargon in sciences or mathematics?
Yeah. Well, the first point is, again, just to continue with what Gurpreet was saying. I think that's an extremely important point, that there is nothing called a jargon in itself. So, Gopal used the term supplementation, for example. Somebody might say when they read it, oh, that's jargon. There is independently, there's nothing called a jargon. Jargon is a relational term, how it is presented in the midst of other texts. So as long as you don't understand what that concept or whatever term you are talking about, then you tend to think of it as jargon. So we go back to this very simple thing that, look, supplementation may not be a jargon in one context, but when you read it in some other context, it is a jargon because you don't understand it. You don't understand, look at it that way. Then we recognize that what is a jargon, what is not a jargon is in the reader, and that's the audience question, who is going to read that, etc. So I think we have just invested too much perhaps into this worry about jargon, and very correctly, as the question in the case of the natural sciences, there are technical concepts. So it's very, for many of their descriptions, they go into technical concepts. And of course, social science is filled with technical concepts. But the difference again, and I want to come back to this point which I made earlier, that what seems to be the case in the social science and humanities discourse is that people who read it, because of the question of using a common monolingual, let's say just English text, for example, somehow it seems to people who know English that they can understand the subject. And I've always had this problem, and I'm very glad Gurpreet said it and not me, that literary theory and culture studies have caused a fundamental, are based on a very fundamental problem that, for example, because you know English, you'll understand discourses written in English. The very similar kind of a problem which we have had in relation to making sense of Indian philosophy today and Sanskrit. So therefore, the point is to decouple this particular naive relationship between saying I have access to language and therefore I have access to the ideas and concepts in that language. So in the case of, and because we all share the common language across audiences, across discourses, and this is what I mean. You'll have a scientist who's never heard of social science, who will listen to something and, who will listen to a talk by, let's say, a well-known sociologist and say to the sociologist, that is a jargon, you haven't understood what you're saying. And this is it's a real example of one of the most important sociologists, who was my colleague in NIAS, Professor M. N. Srinivas. When he spoke about Sanskritization, at the end of the talk, one of the scientists gets up and says, Professor Srinivas, the problem is you haven't understood Indian society. It's one of my classic examples of that, because it's in the common language. And they feel that that language gives them the authority to say, I should also understand what you're saying, and without doing the work which is required of me. So I really, that's what I keep telling students too when we train them, and this question we talked about, I really think we just go back to this falsification. I want them to say something which I can question them about. I don't want to read something where I can see the author is hiding, qualifying. You tell, when I write something, people come and say, what is this nonsense? I don't agree with what you're saying. And my point is not whether you agree with me. Do you agree with the way I've argued for it and what we have presented? So we have to go back to this fundamental question of not clarity of language, not uni-meaning in any sense. My whole work has been to show how scientific meaning is not. It's always semantic plurality is present in the most simple scientific theorization, including mathematical terms. So semantic plurality is very important, but it is the way we are able to place concepts vis-a-vis the other network of concepts and other arguments that we do. Then if we do that, then we can read one text and say it's jargon, and another and say that's not jargon at all.
Very good. Thank you. Sayan and Vrinda, do you want to come in? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions on like the language question and whether we find English language to be a barrier and whether it alienates the audience. Now, of course, like Vrinda mentioned that, we would want to sort of, translate into more languages. That's the practical pedagogic goal for us. But I think this question is also interesting because, what we are trying to do is to present sort of an English, right, which we think could be more intuitive, right? So for example, we assume that, of course, there are many people, I mean, the default sort of audience that we'll have would have some exposure to English and would be able to sort of syntactically follow sort of the phrases. But at the same time, what we sort of try to emphasize is the form of the presentation, right? So for example, in a conversation, for example, some people will say, oh, we find it easier to follow rather than when you present it as an explainer. So at some point, we present sort of our issues as explainers where we'd be like, okay, A, B, C, these are the points. But as soon as we say it in conversation, the same person would say, okay, this is somehow more readable for me, right? The other thing to think about is that, we have a heterogeneous English already, and this is something we comment on in some of our posts, which is sort of the drive towards, standardized English, and, how we need to kind of sort of demystify, the standardization of English. And in fact, accept that there is a plurality of registers within academic English itself, right? So, and I think Bakhtin would be sort of a great a person to sort of think through this question, because, Bakhtin, for example, makes this distinction. I mean, there are two points he makes which are interesting. One is that he'll say that, okay, why is it that, okay, some professor, appears professorial in this intimidating way, and why is that somebody else feels like, okay, you can kind of, that professor is relatable, right? And it's because of the embodiment of speech. So it's not enough to just think of the syntax, but also think in the way it is presented. And of course, at the level of a human embodiment and how we are, of course, speaking to each other, that involves things like body language and all of that. But at the level of the sort of the form, yeah, this is something to think about. And this is exactly the intervention of public pedagogy. And the other sort of thing he says is that, a complex genre like academic writing is made up of many, many primary genres, which include things like exclamations, description, producing lists, questions that you ask. So how is it that, when we think of, writing and reflecting on writing, how is it that we can think of the cognitive work or possibility of each of these primary genres as we combine them to form a more sophisticated genre, rather than thinking of the sophisticated genre as this reified product, right? So that's maybe one way to think about it. Vrinda, would you like to add?
Yeah, another thing I would like to add is that I find some fundamental discomfort in only approaching it as an act of translation. So even when we are talking about lucidity, one of the things we are saying is that lucidity also is creating something. It's adding something to the content of what we are showing, rather than just being a simplification of academic content, or rather than being a mechanical de-jargonization. And since a lot of what we are doing here is drawing upon our own experiences and our own readings, I have sadly not been in academic spaces where academic ideas were being discussed in Hindi, and I've studied all my life in Delhi. So it's also that we need to have those conversations about more academic concepts in other languages before we or while also communicating them in Hindi or whichever other languages we are talking about, instead of being a top-down translation. Yeah, just that.
Okay, so Divya,
Yes.
time to
Wrap up.
wrap up.
Yes.
Okay, it's already late. But it is very interesting. We wanted to have more conversation, but there's a time limit to our Zoom webinar. I don't think I have any purpose to really sum up now. I have already summed up the presentations as and when they were presented. But I think at the end, I would say a couple of things. One is that we really require to think about the methodological challenges of you producing concept, because we require concept to really capture reality in its, so to say, variety and complexity. Otherwise, there will be cacophony of language. So want to avoid that, you require some methodological intervention very urgently. Away from, as Sundar has said and Gurpreet has said that, can you really, jargon is a relative term. Are we wasting our time in this? Because it depends on who is using what. I think it's an important point, and we have to actually think. Using jargon is a falsification. Actually, you are hiding from what reality is and what is its translatability. You can actually, for example, in local languages, there are words, concepts which we can't make sense of, because we are not the part of that particular experience. and that the language, the conceptual language, vocabulary comes from that experience, and the experience which is accumulated historically and has to be actually, it is also present across time and space and has to be captured in one language, one word. And in mathematics, word, it is the figure, it is the number. But in social science, humanities, and philosophy, it is one word. So you require this kind of language. But some people have brought in some language which is not the part of our own experience, part from continental philosophy, as Gurpreet was mentioning. So we have made it our own, but we could not really associate ourselves with that. We have seen this, and so let us try and avoid jargon becoming a intellectual password without which we just can't open the file. So with this, I think I will thank the engaged team, which has taken a lot of efforts to really make this happen. There are in Engage, there are colleagues who have put in a lot of efforts to put it together, and I thank the panelists for making it happen and sparing some time. All these people are so important. The time is so important, but despite the fact, for the love of EPW, they have made it and they joined it, and we will expect them to come for similar occasions in the future as well. With this, I will hand over to Diva to say a few words by way of thanking the panelists. Diva, you want to thank?
Yeah. I would
go ahead.
Thank you so much for this beautiful discussion we had this evening. And in the end, I would just request everyone to subscribe to EPW.
Yeah. You can also comment on the jargon that we use in our forum. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have a great time and stay safe and secure wherever you are. Great. Yeah.